You have to understand something fundamental about the avoidant personality. Distance is not just a preference, it's a strategy. It's how they maintain control, regulate emotions, and protect themselves from vulnerability. For an avoidant, closeness can feel overwhelming, unpredictable, even threatening. So what do? They manage intimacy by creating space, subtle at first, then more pronounced over time. They pull back, they delay responses, they detach just enough to feel safe again. And here's the critical part. This distance is always on their terms. As long as they are the ones deciding when to step back, the system works. They feel in control. They feel emotionally self-sufficient. They can tell themselves, I'm fine, I don't need this. I can leave whenever I want. That belief becomes part of their identity. It's not just behavior, it's philosophy. Independence becomes a shield. But then something unusual happens. Someone doesn't chase, someone doesn't wait. Someone doesn't try to close the gap they created. Instead, that person walks away completely. And in that moment, the entire structure collapses because now distance is no longer a tool, it's a reality. And it's no longer controlled by the avoidant. It's imposed on them. What used to feel like safety now feels like loss. What used to feel like freedom now feels like abandonment. This is where the psychological shift begins. When an avoidant loses control over the distance, they're forced into a position they've spent their entire lives avoiding, emotional confrontation. There's no gradual withdrawal they can manage, no slow fade they can justify. It's abrupt, it's final, and most importantly, it's not their decision. That lack of control creates cognitive dissonance. On one hand, they've always believed they didn't need deep connection. On the other hand, they're now experiencing the absence of someone who mattered more than they admitted. And those two realities cannot coexist peacefully. So the mind starts searching for answers. Why does this feel different? Why can't I just move on like before? Why is this person still on my mind? And here's the truth. They can't forget, because for the first time they didn't get to regulate the ending. Every previous relationship followed a familiar pattern. They distanced themselves. The other person either chased or slowly disconnected. And eventually the emotional intensity faded. But this time, the pattern was interrupted. The other person didn't play their role. They didn't pursue, they didn't protest, they simply chose themselves and left. That breaks the script. And when the script breaks, awareness begins. Now the avoidant is left alone with something they're not used to sitting with. Unresolved emotion. Not processed, not expressed, not controlled, just there, lingering, persistent. And because they never had to develop the tools to fully process that kind of emotional disruption, it stays longer than they expect. It echoes, it replays, it resurfaces in quiet moments, in memories, in comparisons with new people who don't quite measure up. Not because the connection was perfect, but because it was unfinished on their terms. This is why the person who completely walks away becomes unforgettable. Not simply because they left, but because they took the avoidant out of their comfort zone of controlled distance and placed them into the unfamiliar territory of emotional consequence. And that is something the avoidant mind cannot easily resolve. Because in the end, it's not the distance they remember. It's the moment they realized they were no longer the one creating it. If you follow that shift a little deeper, you begin to see that what's really being disrupted is not just behavior, it's identity. Because avoidants don't just act independent. They believe in their independence as a core truth. It's the story they've told themselves for years. I don't rely on people. I don't get attached. I don't need anyone to feel whole. And for a long time, that story appears to work. It works because it's never truly tested under conditions they don't control. As long as they are the ones creating distance, as long as they can step back before things get too intense, they never have to confront the deeper question. What happens if someone I actually care about is no longer there? That's the question they spend their lives avoiding. But when someone finally rejects them completely, when there's no ambiguity, no second chances, no emotional access, that question is no longer theoretical. It becomes real, immediate, unavoidable. And this is where the illusion begins to crack. Because independence in this context is often misunderstood. What looks like strength is frequently a form of protection. What looks like self-sufficiency can be emotional minimization. Avoidants aren't devoid of attachment. They've simply learned to suppress it, to downplay it, to keep it at a distance where it doesn't threaten their sense of control. But suppression is not the same as absence. So when that person leaves, truly leaves, it exposes something the avoidant has kept hidden. even from themselves. It reveals that there was, in fact, an emotional investment. There was meaning, there was connection, and now there is a void where that connection used to exist. And that void is disorienting because it directly contradicts the internal narrative. If they truly didn't need anyone, why does this absence feel so heavy? If they were truly unaffected, why does this person keep resurfacing in their thoughts? Why does their mind keep revisiting conversations, moments, possibilities? This is the psychological tension they're forced to sit with. And here's what makes it even more complex. Avoidants are not naturally equipped to process this kind of contradiction quickly. Their instinct is to downplay, to rationalize, to move forward without looking too closely. But the more they try to dismiss it, the more persistent it becomes. Because truth has a way of surfacing when it's been denied for too long. The rejection, in this case, acts like a mirror. It reflects back something they've spent years avoiding, their own capacity for attachment. And not just attachment, but loss. A loss they didn't choose, a loss they couldn't control, a loss that challenges the very foundation of how they see themselves. And that's why it lingers. Not because they suddenly become emotionally expressive overnight, but because the experience creates a fracture in their belief system. It introduces doubt into what once felt certain. It forces them to reconsider whether their version of independence is genuine freedom or simply a way of avoiding vulnerability. This is where growth has the potential to begin, but it's also where discomfort intensifies, because to truly resolve that tension, they would have to do something unfamiliar, acknowledge that they cared more than they admitted, that they were affected more than they expected, that their independence, while valuable, may have come at the cost of deeper connection. And that realization doesn't come easily, so instead it lingers beneath the surface, quiet but persistent, shaping how they think, how they compare, how they remember. Because once the illusion of emotional invulnerability is broken, it cannot be fully restored. And what remains is a question they can no longer ignore. If I truly didn't need them, why did losing them change me? And if you stay with that question long enough, something even more revealing begins to surface: timing. Because one of the most misunderstood aspects of the avoidant mind is not that they don't feel, it's that they don't feel in real time. In the moment, when the relationship is active, when the connection is present, their primary instinct is regulation, not reflection. They are managing proximity, managing expectations, managing the subtle pressure that comes with emotional closeness. So instead of fully experiencing what's happening, they compartmentalize it. They downshift the intensity. They tell themselves, this isn't that deep. This isn't that serious. And because of that, their emotional experience is delayed. While the other person may be feeling everything vividly, connection, confusion, longing, even pain, the avoidant is buffering, creating just enough distance internally to avoid being overwhelmed. And in doing so, they unintentionally postpone their own emotional processing. But postponed does not mean erased. It simply means stored. So when the relationship ends, especially when it ends in a way they didn't initiate, something unusual happens. The external stimulus is gone. The person is no longer there. The dynamic has stopped. And for the first time, the avoidant no longer has to manage closeness, because there is no closeness left to manage. And that's when the internal experience begins. It's almost paradoxical. They feel more after the person is gone than they allowed themselves to feel when the person was present. Memories that once seemed ordinary now carry emotional weight. Conversations replay with new meaning. Small moments, things they barely acknowledged at the time, suddenly feel significant. And they don't always understand why. Because from their perspective, it seems like the emotion came out of nowhere. But in reality, it was always there, just deferred, just suppressed, just waiting for space to surface. This delayed processing creates a unique kind of attachment. Not one built solely on shared experiences, but on realizations that arrive too late. It's not just, I miss this person. It becomes, I didn't fully see what this was while I had it. And that realization carries weight, because now there's no immediate way to act on it. The person who triggered that awareness is no longer accessible. There's no conversation to clarify, no moment to correct, no opportunity to respond differently. There is only reflection. And reflection, when it's tied to regret or misunderstanding, tends to linger longer than immediate emotion. This is why avoidants often struggle to move on in the way people expect. From the outside, it may have looked like they were unaffected in the beginning, calm, detached, even indifferent. But internally, the timeline is different. Their emotional response doesn't peak at the moment of loss. It builds over time, days later, weeks later, sometimes even months later. And when it arrives, it's often more complex than simple heartbreak. It's layered. There's confusion. Why am I feeling this now? There's curiosity. What did that relationship actually mean to me? And sometimes there's a quiet form of regret. Did I misunderstand something important while I was in it? These are not easy questions to sit with, especially for someone who has spent years avoiding emotional intensity. So instead of resolving quickly, the experience stretches out. It becomes something they revisit in fragments. A thought here, a memory there, a comparison with someone new that doesn't quite feel the same. Because delayed emotion doesn't just fade, it integrates slowly. And in that slow integration, the person who left becomes more than just a memory. They become a reference point, a moment in time where something meaningful was present, but not fully recognized until it was gone. And that is what makes it difficult to forget. Not the intensity of what was felt in the moment, but the depth of what was understood too late. And when you take that delayed realization and place it alongside something even more fundamental, the sense of self, you begin to understand why this experience cuts deeper than it appears on the surface. Because for the avoidant, this is not just emotional, it's existential. It challenges how they see themselves in relation to others. Avoidants, whether they're fully aware of it or not, tend to organize their identity around control. Not in an obvious dominating way, but in a quieter, more internal sense. Control over their time, their space, their emotional exposure, and most importantly, control over endings. They are usually the ones who decide when something has gone too far, when it's too much, when it's time to pull back or walk away. That role becomes familiar, predictable, safe, and over time, it evolves into a kind of unspoken belief. I am the one who leaves. Ooh. Now that belief may never be stated out loud, but it shapes behavior. It creates a psychological advantage. If I leave first, I don't have to experience rejection. If I detach early, I don't have to feel the full weight of loss. It's a preemptive strategy, one that protects not just their emotions, but their ego. Because at its core, being the one who leaves preserves a sense of power. But when someone else steps into that space, when someone else decides clearly and completely to walk away, that structure is disrupted in a very specific way. It's no longer just about losing the person. It's about losing the position they've always occupied in the dynamic. They are no longer the one who left. They are the one who was left. And that shift is not easy to reconcile. Because now, the avoidant is forced into a role they've spent years avoiding. The role of the one who didn't have the final say. The one who didn't control the outcome. The one who, whether they admit it or not, was rejected. And rejection, especially when it contradicts a long-held self-image, has a way of cutting deeper than expected. This is where the ego enters the equation. Not ego in the sense of arrogance, but ego as identity, how we define ourselves, how we maintain consistency in our story. When that story is interrupted, when something happens that doesn't align with who we believe we are, it creates internal tension. For the avoidant, that tension might sound like this. I didn't even want something that serious. So why does it bother me that they left? I was already pulling away, so why does it feel like I lost something? I'm the one who usually moves on. So why am I still thinking about this? These questions don't have immediate answers because they're not just emotional, they're structural. They challenge the internal framework the avoidant has relied on to navigate relationships. And when that framework is shaken, the mind tries to restore balance. It replays events. It analyzes conversations. It looks for moments where control could have been reasserted, not necessarily to reconnect, but to make sense of how the narrative shifted. Because losing a person is one thing. Losing your role in the story is something else entirely. And that's why this kind of rejection lingers. It's not just about attachment. It's about identity disruption. It's about being placed in a position that feels unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and unresolved. Over time, that experience becomes a reference point, not always consciously, but subtly influencing how they interpret future interactions. It may make them more guarded, more reflective, or in some cases more aware of the patterns they once operated on without question. Because once you've experienced what it feels like to not be the one in control of the ending, you can't fully return to the illusion that you always are. And that realization stays with you, not as a loud, overwhelming emotion, but as a quiet shift in perspective. Because in the end, it wasn't just the heart that was affected, it was the identity that no longer fit the story. And when identity is shaken like that, the natural human response is to try to make sense of what just happened, to find some kind of closure, some kind of narrative that restores order. But this is where the avoidant pattern reveals itself in a deeper way. Because if there is one thing avoidants consistently struggle with, it's not just emotional expression, it's emotional completion. They don't naturally move toward resolution. They move away from intensity. So when something ends, especially something meaningful, they don't always process it in a linear, conscious way. They don't sit down, reflect openly, express what they feel, and bring the experience to a clear psychological conclusion. Instead, they do what they've always done. They distance themselves from it internally. They minimize it. They compartmentalize it. They tell themselves it is what it is and keep moving. And in some situations, that works, at least on the surface. But when the ending is not on their terms, when it's abrupt, definitive, and externally imposed, that strategy begins to break down. Because closure is not something you can avoid when the emotional impact is still active beneath the surface. In fact, the more they try to bypass it, the more it persists. This is what we might call unfinished emotional business. It's the accumulation of thoughts that were never expressed, feelings that were never fully acknowledged, and questions that were never answered. And unlike processed experiences, which tend to settle over time, unfinished ones remain open. They loop. They revisit, they resurface in unexpected moments. A memory appears, not just as a recollection, but as a question. What if I had said something different? A moment comes back, not just as nostalgia, but as realization. I didn't fully understand that when it was happening. A feeling emerges, not just as sadness, but as ambiguity. I'm not even sure what I felt, but I know it mattered. And that ambiguity is difficult to resolve. Because closure requires engagement. It requires a willingness to sit with discomfort long enough to extract meaning from it. It requires honesty, not just about the other person, but about oneself. And for someone who has built a pattern around avoiding emotional intensity, that process doesn't come naturally. So instead of reaching a clear conclusion, the experience remains open-ended. And here's the paradox. Avoidants often avoid closure in relationships, but when closure is taken away from them, they feel its absence more acutely than they expect. Because now there's no opportunity to go back and complete the emotional cycle. No final conversation to clarify intentions. No moment of mutual understanding that allows both people to walk away with a sense of resolution. The ending is simply final. And finality without understanding creates persistence. It leaves the mind searching for something that isn't available anymore. It replays scenarios not because it wants to relive the past, but because it's trying to finish it. It's trying to arrive at a conclusion that was never consciously reached. This is why the person who leaves completely becomes so difficult to forget. Not necessarily because they were perfect or even because the relationship was ideal, but because they became the center of an unresolved experience. They represent something that didn't get to be fully processed. And human psychology doesn't easily let go of what feels incomplete. Over time, this unfinished business can take different forms. Sometimes it becomes quiet curiosity. Sometimes it turns into comparison with future connections. And sometimes it remains as a subtle emotional weight that doesn't fully disappear. It just integrates into the background of their thinking. Because what is unresolved doesn't vanish. It adapts. And in that adaptation, the memory of the person remains active, not as a constant presence, but as something that was never fully closed, something that never reached its natural end. Because in the end, it's not always the connection itself that keeps someone attached. It's the absence of a conclusion they never allowed themselves to reach. And when you bring all of this together, the loss of control, the fracture in identity, the delayed emotional processing, the absence of closure, you begin to see why one particular kind of person leaves a deeper imprint than all the others. It's not just someone they were involved with. It's someone who, in a very real sense, saw through them. Because most people, when faced with avoidant behavior, respond in predictable ways. They chase. They try harder, they overextend, or eventually they fade out quietly, confused and unresolved themselves. And in those dynamics, the avoidant remains to some degree hidden. Their patterns aren't fully confronted. Their emotional distance is never truly challenged. It's accommodated, tolerated, or misunderstood. But every once in a while, someone responds differently. Someone recognizes the pattern, feels the inconsistency, understands the emotional unavailability, and instead of trying to fix it or fight it, they make a decision. Not out of anger, not out of impulse, but out of clarity. They choose not to participate in the dynamic anymore. They choose themselves. And that choice does something rare. It removes the illusion, because now the avoidant is no longer interacting with someone who is trying to decode them or earn their closeness. They are facing someone who already understood enough and still decided to walk away, not because they didn't care, but because they cared in a way that required reciprocity. That's a very different kind of ending. It's not chaotic. It's not reactive. It's intentional. And that intention carries weight, because to be seen, truly seen beyond the surface, and then to be left anyway, creates a very specific kind of impact. It's not just rejection. It's recognition followed by departure. It communicates without needing many words. I understand what this is, and I'm choosing not to stay in it. That message is difficult to dismiss because it doesn't leave much room for distortion. The avoidant can't easily reduce it to, they were too emotional, or it just didn't work out. On some level, they recognize that the other person saw the pattern clearly enough to make a grounded decision, and that recognition lingers. It lingers because it introduces a level of awareness that wasn't fully present before. It holds up a mirror, not just to what happened in that specific relationship, but to a broader pattern of relating. It raises a question that doesn't fade easily. If someone could understand me this clearly and still choose to leave, what does that say about how I show up? And that question doesn't always get answered right away, but it stays. It shows up in future interactions, in moments where they feel the urge to withdraw again. In situations where someone new begins to get close, there's a subtle awareness now, a quiet memory of what happens when the pattern goes unexamined. Because this time, it wasn't just another ending. It was an ending that carried insight. And insight, once introduced, has a way of staying active beneath the surface. It doesn't always lead to immediate change, but it alters perception. It creates a reference point. A moment where something was revealed, even if it wasn't fully acted upon. That's why this person becomes so difficult to forget. Not because they were the only one who cared or the only one who mattered, but because they were the one who combined understanding with action. The one who didn't just see, but responded in a way that disrupted the pattern entirely. They didn't chase, they didn't collapse, they didn't stay in confusion, they made a decision. And that decision becomes a marker in the avoidance experience. A point where something shifted, whether they fully acknowledge it or not. Because in the end, it's not just the loss of the person that stays with them, it's the memory of someone who understood them and still chose to walk away. And when you step back and look at the entire picture, something becomes very clear. This was never just about losing a person. It was about being confronted with everything that was avoided. The loss of control, the crack in identity, the emotions that arrived too late, the ego that was forced into a position it didn't recognize, the absence of closure, and finally, the presence of someone who saw clearly and chose differently. All of these elements come together to create an experience that doesn't simply fade with time. It lingers, not because avoidants are incapable of moving on, but because this particular kind of ending bypasses all of their usual defenses. It reaches the places they don't normally access. And what makes it even more powerful is this: nothing about it is dramatic on the surface. There's no chaos, no constant conflict, no explosive ending to point to. Just a quiet, decisive withdrawal from someone who understood that connection without reciprocity is not sustainable. That kind of ending doesn't give the avoidant something to resist. It gives them something to reflect on. And reflection, especially when it touches identity, doesn't disappear easily. Because at some level, they know this wasn't just another relationship. It was a moment where the pattern could no longer hide behind distance, detachment, or delay. It was exposed, not aggressively, but clearly. And once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. So they carry it with them. Maybe not openly, maybe not in a way they can fully articulate, but it shows up in how they think, in how they compare, in the quiet recognition that something about that experience was different, not perfect, not ideal, but real, in a way they didn't fully grasp at the time. And that's the part that stays, because in the end, avoidants don't remember the person who chased them. They don't remember the person who waited endlessly. They remember the one who understood them and had the strength to walk away anyway.